Interview 1, patient 0619200. Could you please state your name?
My name is Kalina Sharma.
Excellent. And do you just want to tell us very, very briefly why you decided to come to us today?
So I am seeking help with my personal fears and anxieties that I feel like I could cope with better. Specifically, my enormous fear of death, not necessarily my own, but other people's. I'm quite hyper aware of the mortality of everybody that I love, and the fact that I'm going to have to be alone one day all by myself.
And thank you, first of all, for your honesty. I just want to go through some of the questions that you answered on the screening form, just to help give me a bit more context. Specifically, when you talked about how horrible the lockdown was for you, and you said that it exacerbated your mental state, which was already bad. Can you just talk to me a little bit about that, and like sort of what is that feeling of still feeling lost? Could you describe that?
Well, because of the unfortunate nature of the lockdown falling right in the middle of my uni career, it kind of meant that I was cut away from a lot of what was meant to be my like prime years for getting to know myself both professionally, creatively, what I wanted to do with myself after uni. And because life was at such a standstill at the time, I feel like I wasn't actually in a place to be able to explore that further. It was more a case of, having to survive every day until the lockdown was over. And because of that, it feels like I'm still behind on that development now.
So, what would you say is your main support system when you feel like that?
In the present day? My main support system would probably be my parents, my best friend who has already graduated uni and therefore is sort of in the same position as me now, and my partner.
And can you tell me what would life be like for you if your partner was no longer in the picture?
Ooh, very difficult probably, especially sort of in like a cohabitation sense. I feel like in many ways I see him as like my little sidekick, as like somebody who's just there day to day. So without being able to sort of express and vent my feelings towards him, they'd kind of just be like bottled up in my head all the time without having like any rational external perspective. And he's also a lot more optimistic than I am, so he can a lot of the time give a better angle on these things than maybe my own biases can.
So you definitely think there's a level of support there which is important and do you think you're on sturdy ground, you and your partner?
Yes.
If that fell away,
yes,
would
I
there be
feel
trouble?
like I'm definitely somebody who needs like a sense of stability.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not like a very spontaneous person. I don't like the unexpected, and I don't like sort of not having a plan. So having some concrete, stable foundations in life, like groundworks of that, definitely makes me feel a lot more secure on the day to day.
Okay, and I want to go into a little bit more about what you said at the start. Thank you, by the way.
That's okay.
You're doing very well. About this sort of fear of death that you mentioned, and you also went into some detail in your form. And I want to just ask you about that really, because you said, you're not so scared about what comes after, but more the wider context of that. Can you go into some of the things, like some of the denotions of death and what scares you about them?
Yes, so because I'm not a particularly spiritual person, so I don't necessarily feel like, I'm not concerned with the afterlife at all, it doesn't really interest me. But what does scare me is having to deal with death in the context of like a permanent ending. So for example, on one hand, there is everything that comes before it, so having to kind of approach death knowing that it's an inevitability and it's going to happen makes me very scared, because I don't think anyone can actually be prepared for dealing with that. And having witnessed grief from like a third person perspective, I definitely think that I would be very unprepared to deal with it, purely because, you know, death, it kind of, there's no sort of, you can't really twist it to look at it optimistically. You can't really rationalise yourself into finding a silver lining, because what is the silver lining at the end of the day? I guess specifically from the perspective of other people dying, like loved ones, I feel like there is definitely a sense of isolation, and I feel like it's the isolation that would affect me the most, like the fact that the people the closest to me, and that essentially form the crux of your life, like no longer exist.
So, grief, almost as a different subject to death, is something, well, that strikes me that you're quite afraid of.
Yes.
Grief, it's a very interesting thing because it's very subjective, but grief does affect people more or less the same way, I think one can say. So that's very interesting what you said about that. I guess my last question on this sort of the fear of death and of grief is, what do you think would happen to you if you experienced grief in the way you've seen others experience it?
I feel like because I am quite like a sensitive and easily moved and quite an existential person to begin with, I feel like it definitely wouldn't be a case of kind of just like keeping myself busy and doing something else. I mean, like whenever kind of intense negative emotions for whatever contextual reason like happen in my life, I feel like my life very much comes to a standstill, which I guess kind of echoes this sense of like over lockdown, being lost came from nothing happening. It would be the same in the sense that it would just be a period of me not doing anything or really like existing in any specific way. Like I wouldn't be able to, I don't feel like I'd be able to work towards anything. I don't feel like I would be able to enjoy anything, and I don't think that I'd be able to actually live so much as just like sort of sustain myself.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense as to why that's something to be scared of. It doesn't sound like an existence. So I do see your fears in there. Thank you. So what we're going to talk about now is we've spoken a little bit about some concerns and fears you have in your present, and we want to talk a bit about the future now. Specifically the fate, sort of the planet and humanity, which I think everyone everywhere has something they're quite frightened about. So in your form you said that one of the things that you speak about is you have a sort of sense of nihilism when it comes to the future, and that's because of, you know, basically generations before us destroying the planet and stuff, and that's also bled into why you find the future scary to think about. So can you just briefly explain what is the nihilism, what specific parts of the future do scare you in terms of this, you know, Earth destruction that you've spoken about?
Yeah, so basically I kind of feel like, I guess I have grown up as somebody who is very much, I suppose, results oriented. Like if I am not working towards anything, or if I'm not good at anything, or if I'm not achieving anything, then what actually is the point? And the fact that everything previous generations would have been aiming to work towards as a way of motivating their life and giving it meaning, namely a family, a house, a retirement, etc., etc. This certain framework of life that we're all expected to follow and expected to ultimately get out of once we put the effort in, isn't something that's guaranteed or even probable anymore. And because of that, the nihilism basically comes from a sense of what is the point? Like, what is the point of actually getting a career and getting all these things and being motivated by things on the day-to-day if you might not even get anything out of it at the end of the day because the planet will fall apart?
And what about the possibility that none of that will happen?
Well, I guess like most of us, that's the only option we can vouch for, because regardless of whether we like to or not, life will still move forward. And therefore, even though the future isn't guaranteed, we're still going to have to make those steps, because what other choice do we have?
Interesting. Okay. Now, I listed a bunch of sort of quite frightening things, and I just wanted you to, tick which ones seemed the most horrific to you. And it came down to 3 for you, which were global pandemics, human resource depletion, and species extinction. Now, all of those things are very, very real, some of which have already happened. And so what you said earlier about sort of working towards, or feeling like you're working towards nothing, that's very real in a world where this has happened, species extinction, that there isn't really a place for work there unless it's in gathering wood for some sort of post-apocalyptic humanity. So I guess what I want to ask you is, when you mentioned about this post-apocalyptic scenario, what is it about that that scares you so much?
Well, I mean, I'm always the first person when watching any kind of post-apocalyptic film or TV show to say that I am not interested in surviving in this kind of situation, and I would objectively be the first to off myself. Mainly because I feel like living in a world where that isn't the case, I already kind of struggle enough with. So having to have this unimaginable level of struggle is just so inconceivable to me that I don't know, I feel like I wouldn't be able to, I guess, once again, work towards anything meaningful apart from surviving. Therefore, what is the point? It very much echoes the nihilism of just, what is the point of surviving if you're just surviving? And that's the bare minimum you'd be doing if you did not have access to basic needs.
And I'm going to throw a sort of curveball question in here. What would that answer change if you were responsible for another person in this situation?
Oh, this is very The Last of Us. Possibly. I feel like most likely yes, because I feel like generally I am definitely somebody who feels like a strong sense of responsibility and duty, and in a way of like, I suppose, fulfilling a need or fulfilling a role that I am given. If I'm giving a task, I want to be able to execute it, but also on a personal, emotional level, I feel like having external motivation is what drives me rather than internal motivation. So definitely I think that would probably change my perspective, yes.
Okay, so having spoken to you and looked at all your notes and stuff, there are 2 films which I recommend you watch as a way of building sort of a sense of resilience to some of the things you spoke about today. The two things that I've chosen to pinpoint with sort of prescribing this media are your fear of death and grief, and how that affects everyone around you, how it affects yourself, and how it affects your relationship with loved ones and others, and sort of bleeds into other facets of life, as you said, like not being able to function properly, work, etc. And the other one is more of a, you know, a generic fear of a quite desolate future. One, as you said, you're terrified of the idea of a species extinction, of human resource depletion. And two films in particular deal with those in a very specific way that I think would be a great benefit to you. So the first one is called The Babadook, directed by Jennifer Kent in 2014. It's an Australian film about a mother who loses her husband very, very suddenly in a car accident while she's pregnant with her son.
That does sound like my worst nightmare, I must admit.
It's a scary film, so I will warn you, there are, you know, side effects may include some heart palpitations, potential nightmares, but it's a very, very, very good story about how grief becomes a almost physical manifestation in itself and starts tormenting this family. Grief becomes this literal monster. But the main reason I want you to watch it is because of how the main character and her son confront it head on, and eventually, without revealing too much, because I want you to at some point enjoy this film as well, they manage to have a relationship with this grief where they're not completely separate from each other, but they feed off one another in a way which is manageable. And that's the thing that this film communicates, is that grief isn't something that goes away, but it's something you can manage. And this film does it in a very, very good way.
Sure.
So that's something I'd recommend you. Okay, and for the second film I would recommend is called The Road by John Hillcoat from 2009, an American film with Viggo Mortensen from Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
Yeah. And this film, almost sort of an opposite of the first one, it's about a father and his son who are trying to survive in a sort of post-apocalyptic wasteland where all animals have died and most trees and wildlife has ceased to exist and it's dying. Humanity has fallen, government's fallen, people are turning to cannibalism, and it's all a result of global warming, obviously. So very in line with some of your quite specific fears of the future.
Yes.
But what's more about this film is that there is an overbearing sense of just sort of endeavour to stay alive, and there are sort of themes of, well, this father and this son just want to survive. He wants his child to survive, and it gives you a positive ambiguity to the future, because without ruining the ending, it's one of those endings which allows you to make the decision as to what happens, but not in a way that's too open. You meet these new people and things, there's a light in this film which reminds people watching it that all is not lost. And it delves into sort of childhood trauma a little bit, and very much so that idea of instability that you spoke about.
Yes.
Because it's a very, very real look at post-apocalyptic stuff. There's no zombies, there's no, you know, nuclear fallout. It's very, very much how is humanity going to survive, and it's very grounded, and I think it would do you a lot of good to watch it.
I feel like the things with grave reality probably scare me the most, so that's probably...
The thing about films, they give you a closure, they give face to an invisible threat, a thought that you have, and by giving face and closure to that thought, that fear, you can work on feelings towards it.
Yes.
And I think both of those films do a good job of allowing that to happen. Again, you can probably get this on Netflix or Amazon Prime, but yeah, do check it out.
Excellent, thank you very much.
No problem at all. thank you very much for visiting us, and thank you for your honesty. And yes, do try those films out, and if you notice your symptoms worsening, please do get back in touch. We may have prescribed the wrong kind of thing for a person like you. But if you notice some great change and some positive action, then happy days, and you might even find interest in more films like it, in which case do get back in touch. But yeah, thank you very much, and we'll end it there.
Thank you very much.
Okay, commencing interview with patient 18181968. Could you state your name, please?
Yes, Dick Season.
Thank you for coming to Lumia ERI Specialists. So what we're going to do, Mr. Season, is we're going to go through what you've written on your screening form. I'm going to talk about key bits, talk about some fears, some concerns you have about the future, and then as you're probably aware, what we do here is prescribe media to give you some resilience towards some of those fears. And yeah, so I guess first off, could you just tell us why have you decided to come to get our services exactly?
Well, I just thought any help that I could possibly get really around this topic would be a bonus. So yeah, I've tried drugs, self-help books. So yeah, I'm here for help.
Excellent, cool. Okay, well thanks for your honesty. So I think what we're going to do is just jump straight into it. And we're going to start just by talking about the first section you answered, which was about sort of general fears or phobias. And also about pandemic life or post-pandemic life. And in your screening form, you were quite vague. You just said, yes, I do feel more stressed, anxious, etc. because of the lockdown. Can you just briefly describe or explain why that is?
It's only loosely attached to lockdown, but the world did change via lockdown. So things have got financially more difficult, getting hold of things is more difficult, just more uncertainty. So it's not so much about being in a world where I could get ill more easily or anything like that. It's to do with sort of, I guess, a bit of security was pulled out from underneath me. So it's that.
Sort of a fear of uncertainty and a lack of foundation in a way.
A sort of kind of financial structure, looking into the future, thinking, shit, things aren't as settled and certain as I imagined they were.
Great, thank you very, very much. Okay, so that's quite interesting because it bleeds quite a lot into some of your general phobias and future concerns. And also what's interesting about your case is that the fears themselves are very grounded. They're not very abstract or ambiguous in what it is, like, I'm scared of being alone, etc. They're very specific. What you wrote is that you have some sort of fears about financial stress or strain and how this will affect your quality of life in older age and retirement. Could you just go into that a little bit?
Yeah, just reaching an age where I'm not feeling immortal anymore, and the future is going to be operated in this body, and it's a bit scary because my trade and the way I earn money is through this body, like I'm a carpenter. So as I'm heading into an area where I'm still going to have to need money, I actually don't at the moment really have the skills, if my body deteriorates, to earn money into that period of my life. So it's going to have to be some adjustments.
And this sort of background anxiety you have about that, did that come from anything in particular?
I don't know. It's hard to pinpoint it. It's pretty I mean, I made it all sound very simple and practical, my thoughts on this, but it's pretty overwhelming, the fear.
And why do you think that is?
Because it's all unknown. So it's fear of the unknown. So it's ballooned much bigger than it would be if I had something real to kind of get on and solve. It's just a kind of big unknown path. And the only thing I'm pretty certain of is that I won't be as well equipped to deal with it as I am now.
Okay, so Mr. Season, you spoke about the future in the screening form, specifically about a fear of losing personal resources and a supportive society. What did you mean by a supportive society and being scared of losing that?
I've had a couple of experiences recently which are, early on in this whole process of getting older, but made me realise that my support network is pretty minimal. So when I'm up against it, it's just me up against it, really. There's only very few people I can turn to. So, whether it's to do with society or just what I've done so far, I haven't built a particularly big network of support. And I'm looking towards a future where, I don't know, not really living in a society that will teach me how to do it. I don't think it doesn't seem to do it naturally. So I'm thinking maybe I need to sculpt that myself somehow.
Some of the more specific fears that I listed are things that you find concerning a human resource depletion and climate change.
Yeah.
And I guess what's interesting about that is that you'd think that humanity would become more supportive of each other in the face of that. But what do you think society how would they respond to something like resource depletion or natural disasters brought around by climate change? Do you think there's potential for a society to come together in that?
I think all of it will happen. I think there'll be people who just don't think about it at all and blunder on. There's lots and lots of people who are thinking about it intently. There's a hell of a lot of engineers and scientists, and that is their life's goal. And there is the next generation coming through, and they're a hell of a lot more focused on the future of this planet. I don't want to say that it's not important to me, but I'm aware of the fact that it's really about my kids and their kids and not really about me. But what I do is important, but not as important as what gets set up for my children and their children to be living in. Yeah, so I think all of it's happening. I don't think the very old are of any great help in this process. It's going to be up to the younger generations to push forward these changes.
Okay, commencing with part 3 of the interview. Thank you, Mr. Season. So, after talking a lot about some of your general fears and concerns about the future, I've come to the conclusion that you have quite an immense or intense fear of having a lack of foundation and personal resilience, especially in old age retirement, and that's mirrored quite a lot in your fear of financial stress and being sort of unable to keep up with a world which is growing less and less supportive. So there are a couple of films that I'm going to prescribe to you which I think deal with or navigate some of those sort of fears you have in quite extreme ways, but also in ways that are, I guess, a good way for you to sit and experience in a safe, simulated setting, which is what a film is. So the first film is called Exhibit A, which is a 2007 found footage film directed by Dom Rotheroe. And so basically what it depicts is a very, very hyper-real story about a man whose financial stresses grow to such an extreme that it begins to affect his mental state and his family dynamic, ultimately leading to something very, very brutal and unimaginable. And it sounds really horrible on the surface, but I'm recommending you watch this because it shows in that simulated setting an improbable but possible worst case scenario that taps into that fear of financial insecurity. And exposing yourself to that should, in some way, hopefully offer you a form of emotional strengthening, a preparedness, and also offer a cautionary message in a way about, how financial stress can, for some people, become a monstrous thing. And also a thing to look out for when you're watching it is how this man's approach to his family and his children is warped by this financial stress. So it should, for you, hopefully, in some way instill a sense of, okay, well, at least I'm not like that guy. It sounds crude, but I mean what I say. Film number 2, which is in response to sort of more of those general fears about the future, resource depletion, global warming, and worrying about a world that doesn't accommodate the needs of your kids and their kids, etc. Is The Road, directed by John Hillcoat in 2009. And that film, not sure if you're familiar, is one about a man and his son trekking through this post-apocalyptic wasteland, which is completely devoid of all resources that humans need to survive. And while they're trekking through this, they're also trying to avoid these cults of cannibals that have turned to cannibalism as a means of survival. And I've recommended you this one because it showcases a really, really dark but ultimately hopeful story about father and son trying to survive and surviving in the face of utter annihilation. Its ending, which I won't spoil for you, is not a negative one, which from a film I just described sounds very bizarre, but it's a very, very good story about how even in times of utter, annihilation and horror, there are still these moments of humanity that pop up. And I think that would be a good one for you to watch, especially since you have these sort of fears of being unable to keep up in a world which is growing less supportive. Children's children will, have to deal with that, as you say, and this film shows an example of it in an extreme sense where maybe it is possible. Do you have any questions about that?
No, I'm just intrigued to go and watch these two. Yeah.
Any problems? Do get back in touch. Maybe we picked the wrong thing for you, but yeah, in any case, thank you very much. And any final questions or anything?
No, I think that's good. Yeah, thanks for your time there. Yeah?
No problem. Okay, commencing interview with patient 09151994. Can you please state your name?
Donald Dunham.
Very nice to meet you. Can I call you Donald?
You may.
Fantastic. Thanks for coming in to see us today.
Thank you.
As you know, here at Lumiere ERI Specialists, we sort of specialise in prescribing certain films and media to those who are looking to get some strengthening of emotion and preparedness to certain things in the present or the future. Could you just describe why you decided to come to us for these services?
Well, I feel like it's important to reach out and sort of explore these sort of fears that you have. It's not something that many people necessarily always talk about, and I think it would probably be quite a unique way to address those fears and see how you can help them in a sort of holistic approach.
So what we're going to do, Donald, is we're going to jump straight into the first part of the interview, which goes into some of your general fears that you spoke about on the screening form. So what we're going to look at is your phobia of the sea. Now, in retrospect, when the interview is over, you might think that this was a bit irrelevant to talk about, but you'll see what I mean. you basically said, and I thought it was quite a good quote, was "Don't fuck with the sea."
Yeah.
Can you just sort of explain your philosophy there?
Well, I think a large part of it was possibly the RNLI sort of media campaign that they did with the Respect the War thing that they did. And there was a time where I like went out to try surfing one time and just got absolutely battered and just like ran straight back to shore, tail between my legs, and I was just like, you know what, I'm just not gonna fuck with the sea. Like, just don't fuck with it.
That's fair enough. And if you don't mind me bringing it up, you mentioned something in your early childhood about the sea or a pool or something. Could you remind me of that?
Yeah,
if you're comfortable
yeah,
to.
of course. Yeah, it's fine. I mean, I don't actually really remember it personally necessarily. Apparently, I nearly drowned in a pool on holiday when I was a small child, and they had to I would literally just kind of like sunk to the bottom somehow. So they had to dive in and rescue me. So it's possible that maybe subconsciously that sort of instilled a bit of fear of sort of drowning, deep water sort of thing.
That certainly could be part of it, but is there anything about the sea in particular that you find frightening?
The unknown, I think. It's the vastness. It's unforgiving. It's unrelenting. It doesn't. Trying to think of the word. It doesn't care who or what you are. The sea is going to do what it's going to do. The waves are going to come. The tide's going to come in. The tide's going to come out. The water will erode rock. However long it takes, it will fuck something up eventually, and it can fuck things up. I think it's just like the vastness of the deep unknown that is unsettling, I suppose.
I'm just going to blue sky this. Is there something about not being in control around the sea that you find frightening when it comes to it? The fact that it controls you?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the fact that you're completely at the mercy of it. You know, you could get pulled by an underwater current, or caught out by a riptide, or just like knocked out by a wave or something. You know, yeah, I guess you completely relinquish all control when you're in the sea.
Okay, so when I asked you a lot about your concerns with the future, you mentioned three things, which was global warming, economic collapse, and resource depletion. Just before I go into the next part of that, can you just very briefly explain what is it about those things that scare you?
I think they're the most real. They're the things that there's tangible evidence that resources will dwindle. It's entirely likely that there could be a global economic collapse, and climate change, global warming. There's again tangible, real evidence that these things are happening. So I think it's the real stuff that we can see happening in slow motion that is sort of the most scary.
In specific, when we talk about resource depletion, are we talking about fossil fuels? Are we talking about
fossil fuels and just sort of general human resource depletion as the world population keeps growing, demand for food and nutrition will continue to grow, and unless we sort of get a handle on those things, that will become an issue. I know the world is big, but there's only so much space you can dedicate to farming and stuff like that.
Just going to go into sort of pandemic speak for a second, because obviously when I asked you about it, you seemed quite resilient when it came to pandemic. You used it to your advantage, I suppose. But let's say that instead of COVID, it was a really debilitating disease that affected everyone in the same way, in the form of perhaps, you lose the function of some of your organs or your sensory organs. Just sort of picture that. What would you think, feel, or what would you even do in that situation? What would you want?
It's a great question. I really don't know. I'm sort of willing to be led by the science, I think, and sort of, we'd look to the think tanks and sort of those sorts of groups for help, and I'd be prepared to listen. I listened to the advice when the coronavirus pandemic happened. I'd be willing to listen to the advice for anything else that was much, much worse. and just sort of hope that people took it on board a little bit better.
Okay, so just before we go into the diagnosis and prescription, I just wanted to ask you about your final sort of big thing, the big fear that I've, asked everyone about. And for you, it was something happening that rendered you unable to take care of yourself.
Yep.
So can you briefly, for me, go into that mentality? Like, what is it about that scares you more than anything?
I think the biggest part is I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to have someone needing to look after me 24/7. If I can't wipe my own ass for, if something happens to me, and for the rest of my life I won't be able to wipe my own ass, then that's a big fucking weight on someone that has to do that for me. It's not just the ass wiping, it's obviously everything that comes with it. Maybe I need to be fed, I need to be bathed, I need to be, just looked after. For me, that's not a nice existence. That's just, it's just an existence. And I think if I was in that situation, I would prefer not to be on the earth anymore. As cruel or as dark, maybe horrible that might sound, that's how I feel. Obviously, there's loads of people in the world that cannot wipe their own ass for one reason or another. And there's plenty of people that are willing to look after them. That's fine, give them the best life that they can enjoy. But, for me, I wouldn't want that.
What we're going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think your main fears are based on what we've spoken about and what you've written. So what I'm going to diagnose you, I guess, with is a fear which comes from a lack of control. And what I got that from is it's sort of mirrored in your fears of the sea, its vastness, its power, its danger, and also your fear of kind of giant world catastrophes that would render humanity unable to control anything anymore or keep themselves alive.
Mm-hmm.
And also that final fear of not being in control of your own body, being immobile, disabled, comatose, etc. And that's not a very niche fear. I think there's a lot of people that are scared about that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But what is interesting for you is that definite focus on the control aspect,
Mm-hmm.
the feeling of being a burden, and the feeling and sort of the acknowledgement of all the negative feelings that come with being immobile, paralysed, disabled, anything like that. So there are two films in particular that I want to prescribe to you today.
Sure.
Both of which deal with what we were talking about in a similar way, but in totally different mediums. The first is called Blindness, directed by Fernando Meirelles in 2008. And this one is sort of a thriller, horror film in a way, which basically depicts a global pandemic, and the illness, as it were, is just blindness. And it follows a handful of characters, but it focuses on one in particular. A woman who does not have the blindness, she's immune to it. So she goes into this immune with her husband, who unfortunately is blind.
Yeah.
And she spends most of the film keeping him safe, keeping him alive, tending to him, which I think was eerily similar to what you were talking about being a burden.
Yeah.
But specifically, this film, it taps into the fear of not being in control of your own body, but in a very grounded way. And it also helps paint a picture of being out of control very suddenly, because the blindness comes on instantly, and the implications of a society falling apart. But also, I recommended it because ultimately the film paints a good picture of people overcoming that and thriving and surviving through it. It's a good example of watching these people go through something that completely immobilizes them. They can't go to the toilet properly, everything's filthy, you've got this woman who's caring for this man in secret, and it all comes to a head and ultimately yields sort of quite a positive message, which I think you might find quite helpful.
Cool, yeah, that sounds good.
So that's the first one. The second one is very, very different, and might be more up your street, I'm not sure, but it's called Monkey Shines, directed by George A. Romero in 1988. Now this is a film about a man who becomes paralysed, can't do anything for himself, So he gets given a monkey, which has been genetically modified to have sort of superior intelligence, as it were,
Right.
who does lots of the jobs for him that he needs, feeding, bathing.
Yeah.
However, it becomes apparent that the link, the bond that they share, is a lot more sinister, and this monkey starts acting out Alan, who's paralysed, his innermost dark desires and bad feelings and sort of violence.
Okay.
And the reason I'm prescribing that is because it taps into that idea of being out of control with an inability to fulfill your innermost desires.
Yeah.
While also communicating the idea that overcoming anger and violence and destructive tendencies can happen and is possible when you're in this prison, this physical prison. Obviously, this is quite a tongue-in-cheek film. It's very, very obvious that it's silly, but it's this metaphor that the monkey is, which is that, well, the monkey enacts and does all of these horrible things in the name of the disabled man.
Yeah.
And it's a bit more comedic, and that's why I threw it in there, because Blindness is quite a dark film.
Yeah.
So they're two very different films, but both deal with some of your quite big fears. Well, the first one in a quite grounded way, the second one in a silly way. Why not have some fun, right?
Sounds good.
So that's why I brought up the sea in the beginning, because of that lack of control and the connotations of that. Yeah.
Great.
Do you have any questions for me?
No, thank you very much. It's been very interesting.
Okay, and starting interview with patient 12081999. Can you please state your name?
Skylar Logworthy.
And how are you today, Skylar?
Okay, I'm okay today.
Good. Well, thank you for coming to speak with us today. I just want to basically make this an informal chat. Thank you for also filling out the pre-screening form. I'm going to basically go into that a little bit and just ask you some questions about the things that you've written. Don't worry about it, and feel free not to answer if you don't want to.
Okay.
But yeah, we'll basically start with why you have come to us today, because as you know, we're an emotional resilience inoculation service. We basically prescribe media to help you get some emotional resilience. So could you just tell us briefly why you decided to come to us?
Well, I feel like since I spend so much time on my phone anyway, and my whole social issue with friends and kind of being left out, I feel like if there was just a media-based thing to help, I just felt that would kind of just aid my mental stability. So I thought I'd give it a go, better than some other options.
Okay, well, we'll just jump straight into it then. You're quite an interesting case, actually, because there's some more general fears, which we all have, but then some very specific ones, which I've picked out. But we'll start at the beginning, which is about pandemic living. And it says here that you felt quite a lot of FOMO, or fear of missing out. But also, alongside that, you had this responsibility that you felt you had to adhere to guidelines, and that created this uncomfortable contrast between these two feelings. Can you just explain that to me a little bit?
Well, for me in that time frame, my brother had a disabled little girl with breathing issues, so it was like the hyper-realism. Like it was kind of like, oh, you have to stay inside and like follow the rules. As much as I wanted to do that, obviously it was also like, oh, you want to go out and you want to be with your friends. But because I had a family member who I kind of thought, fuck, if this actually, if it just went from person to that person, then they literally would be dead, you know what I mean? It's like the realism of that it could affect someone in my family. So it was suddenly like, fuck, well, I might as well just stay, and like these things are important. But obviously other people, I feel like maybe just didn't take it as seriously, so they were just like, oh, we can hang out and it's fine, because they weren't actually seeing the effects. But because I was so scared of them becoming true for someone that I actually knew the realism of it could actually happening to, it was just like, well, what's the harm in just following the rules, you know what I mean? So.
And it also, sort of going on from that, you said that you developed this quite nasty anxiety around being left out and forgotten. If you're comfortable with it, could you please dive into that a little bit?
Well, I feel like it's one of those kind of things people meet up and then maybe like a joke happens or some memories and it's kind of like, oh, haha, you weren't there. But like, I feel like the experience that I've had with some people is that I've had that, but like to the extreme, like, you know, when they make group chats or they met up that one time and they completely converted a shed into something, you know what I mean? Then that's kind of like, then their group, like they're the shed group and they did it, even though they were friends. So it was kind of a bit like, I felt like if I wasn't there for certain memories, those memories then like form the structure of the group. And because obviously with work and family and all these other things going on, half the time I'm never there to do all these like social things with people. So in the past, because things that happened have just like made the group stronger, and it is like the classic case of oh yeah, you weren't there for the joke, you wouldn't understand, just became so hyper real that now the fear is just carried on, that I feel like if I don't go to certain important things, that then my value within the structure of a friendship group will just be like nil to none because I wasn't there for that event.
And what is it specifically about being forgotten that scares you?
I don't know. It's like a weird, uncomfortable feeling. I just guess not being valued, because I know that I can be such a good friend and a good person that I'm a bit like, well, why wouldn't someone kind of want to be? And then I start disvaluing myself, kind of thinking, I see this in myself, if other people don't, then clearly it's not true. Why am I guessing I'm not a value? And then it's just a hyper-extended, you know, kind of like spiral into, okay, well in that case, they're doing this, which means I have zero value, and then it hurts my self-confidence kind of thing.
Okay, well thank you very much for being so honest with that. Okay, and I guess just the last thing I'll ask about that is, let's say you were the last person on Earth, okay? What would that be like for you? Because it's not just you've been forgotten, it's the fact that you're the only one there to remember. So what would that be like for you?
I don't know, mixed emotions about that. I feel like the reason why I'm the last person on Earth would be important, because when you said that, my first thought was kind of like, oh, like a positive one in the sense of like peace, there isn't any friends or anyone there to actually betray you, it's just me, so you know, my only views are my own. So I thought the initial response when you said that was actually, oh, that could be okay. Then I thought actually the value of having people around you isn't one that you can kind of miss up on. So even though my first reaction was like, yay, no one can hurt me and my self-confidence can just stay within my own bubble, then there's also the fact of like, I want people to see that. I want people to see that I can be a good person and see my values that I see in myself. So if I was the last person on Earth, I'd be like, yay, great, look how great I can be. But it's like, wait, there's no one around to see that I could be that for them. So I feel like now it would be fucking shit.
Okay, commencing part 2 of the interview. How are you doing, Skylar?
Yeah, good, a little shaky, but I'm okay.
Excellent. Okay, so now we're going to go into this part of the interview which talks about the future and your concerns about that, which is something all of us have to face.
Mm-hmm.
But the things people fear about it are all very different. And in your screening form, I noticed that there was a sort of a focus on a fear of not achieving certain goals or getting to an age where you can no longer achieve those goals.
Yeah.
And alongside that, a quality of life getting progressively worse and making it harder to achieve those goals.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you sort of this worry about missing out on life, and then going into more general ones, you know, this fear of the cost of living, of mass flooding, of nuclear warfare. But also what I thought was really interesting was when you mentioned that without a home, where do you belong?
Yeah.
So I know I just sort of listed off a lot of stuff there, but do you want to talk to me about that?
Well, I feel like whenever I've had big mental breakdowns, and even though obviously for the past 4 years I haven't, you know, your home's not where your parents are, I haven't lived at my parents'. I've lived somewhere else, like in Cornwall, I've moved around, it's okay because I've made that my temporary home. And you make it your safe space, and when you finish the day then you come home to that, and that is kind of where you go and you're safe and you're happy. But I kind of thought even in those situations when I would still have a mental breakdown in what I've temporarily deemed at the time as my home, I feel like I would still need to go home to my mum's house or the place that I grew up. So I guess when I answered the question, I kind of thought, like, if that wasn't there and I always just had to have the temporary home, which is fine, I made it my home, but when, push comes to shove and you're really at your bare bones not okay, if that wasn't there, I don't know, I couldn't imagine what it would feel like.
It's very interesting. And I guess, if you're worried about something like a mass flood and nuclear warfare, a home is out, a home that you've described would be out of the question,
Gone.
And what is that what scares you about nuclear warfare, or are there other things in that really does scare you?
I think the fact that home would be gone, and the things in home and around home. Obviously, if the people were still there, but the whole environment is gone, maybe that wouldn't be as severe. But I think for me, the location and what I've deemed as my childhood home, if that disappeared, I think that would severely affect me. Yeah.
Among this fear of being left out, of being forgotten, and whether you achieve these goals and losing a home, what in all of that scares you the most, really, that pops out and wakes you up in the night?
I think fear of missing out, with some strings attached of just not being valued as a friend, not being valued as a co-worker, not being valued as a designer, just not being a part of something valued and seen. I think that's the thing that would keep me up most at night, kind of being putting in your all, and then people still looking the other way type scenario.
Okay, so Skylar, thank you again for coming to us. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to offer a prescription which is made up of 2 films which I think will offer you a sort of resilience, and I'll explain why. So, the first film I'm recommending you is 28 Days Later, directed by Danny Boyle in 2002. It's a British film, and it depicts a total societal collapse as a result of medical experimentation and the breakout of a sort of zombie kind of virus. And specifically the reason I'm prescribing this to you is because it follows Jim, who wakes up from a coma having been completely forgotten about at the time of the outbreak. So he wakes up alone in a hospital, discovers he's been left behind to fend for himself and effectively start life again from scratch, while also adhering to a new and really worse quality of life. And that sounds horrible on the surface, but I thought it would be good to show you that, because you mentioned the thing that scares you the most about being forgotten is the idea that you don't have value. And that's a very current theme in this film. Jim wakes up realizing he's been abandoned, not just by his friends, his family, everyone in the entire world has abandoned him. So he has no value. But I want to show you this more so because there is a sense of hope established when Jim ends up meeting others and starts trying to build a foundation for life and the future, ultimately showing how humanity sort of persists in the face of annihilation. And that's sort of one of the more positive case studies around this concept. And I think if you watch that, not only will it expose you to some quite dark truths, but also some quite positive ones.
Okay.
Do you have any questions about that?
No, that sounds quite good actually.
Cool. Okay, and the second film, this one I've done secondary because it's a little bit more raw and a bit out there, but it's called Threads, directed by Bill Hines in 1984, another British one. And this one is very, very grounded in that it depicts a nuclear winter in the UK, in a very grounded, very chronological way, showing all facets of how the fallout affects government, society, policing, etc. It's cited often as one of the most realistic depictions of a nuclear war if it were to happen in the UK.
Yeah.
Now, this film is not an easy watch. There isn't a happy ending. There isn't any sense of hope, really. But the point of watching this is that it taps into a very specific fear of nuclear war in an extremely realistic sense. It covers how quickly humanity tries to adjust, but is woefully unprepared, and you also get to know characters including their families, as well as all of the goals that they wanted to achieve, which are cut short. And I know it sounds like sort of rubbing salt into a wound that hasn't fully healed, but the idea of watching that is that it exposes you to something which you're very scared of in a safe simulated setting. So you can build a sense of power against it, of strength, of preparing, if you want to do that. But like I said before, that film is not an easy watch. You know, I'd viewer discretion and all that, but I think that would be a very good one for you to watch because it taps into a lot of the fears that you were talking about and have concerns about. Okay, well, I'll get that printed out for you. Again, talk to Sandra, she'll show you the sources to find that. But do you have any questions for me, Skylar, before we end?
No, that is everything. Thank you, Doctor.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Have a good day. Okay, so commencing interview with client 04291993. Could you please state your name?
St. John Delaney.
Excellent. Thank you very much for coming in, St. John. And obviously you know about us. We are Lumiere ERI specialists. We specialise in emotional resilience inoculation via various media. Can you just briefly explain, doesn't have to be very long, just a sentence or two, what has brought you to us today?
So I've been experiencing a lot of distress lately just around general world events, including obviously COVID, but probably more poignantly climate change, and just general life frustrations, not knowing where to go and what to do with my life.
Thanks for your honesty. Well, thank you as well for filling out that screening form. It was very insightful and has given us a lot to work with. So what we're going to do, St. John, is go through some of your fears and some of your concerns about the future, have a brief conversation, and then see if I can sort you out with some media that might help you through some of the concerns and sort of conflict you're feeling internally.
Yeah, let's give it a go.
Okay, so part one then, let's have a look at sort of pandemic life and then some of your general fears. So you mentioned that you feel generally more stressed at times because of COVID, because of the pandemic. And I guess just briefly, could you explain why you think that is?
I guess it created a lot of change in my life, be it moving location, leaving where I was living and starting from scratch somewhere else. And I think just generally it caused a lot of change in terms of time spent isolated working from home, which wasn't a thing before, staring into a computer screen in an empty room, feeling like you're going slightly deranged. I actually started finding myself only working from home, even though I was meant to be working from the office, but I was probably happier when I was in the office, but still didn't want to, just because I didn't want to see people there.
What is it about seeing people there that put you off?
I don't know if it was me seeing them and them seeing me, so I can procrastinate so much. But yeah, I don't know, I think I'd gotten used to just being able to do my own thing and feeling a kind of element of freedom, so suddenly being back in person and feeling like everything's controlled and people know if you've had a little line and you're late and everything, causing stress.
You mentioned that when it comes to sort of fears or phobias, making decisions is a big one, because of a sort of an indecisiveness or a general inability to making decisions. And what is it about making decisions that freaks you out so much?
I'm not totally sure what it boils down to, but I guess maybe fear of making the wrong choice and just not being able to weigh up the impact each different decision will actually have. So yeah, I guess being able to simulate and forecast accurately what each decision's actually going to do. But sometimes I just decide I don't really know what to do, so just pick one of them at random, and that tends to work, but maybe also doesn't. I wonder what life could be like if you could be better at decision making. Maybe it's quite an art being good at decision making.
Have you made a decision in your life that's been so catastrophically wrong that you think it's caused this way of thinking? If you want to share that, you don't have to.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I guess every decision's led to you being who you are and where you are. So generally, decisions have been good, but also feeling slightly lost in career choices and not really knowing what to do maybe means I should have done something different at university, or made different career choices, but I don't know what that would look like, and I don't know what's around the corner anyway, so it's kind of hard to tell. But yeah, there's a lot of unknowns for sure.
What you've written in your screening form was very honest, and it was that you're trying to understand where you are in relation to advancements of AI, as well as world pressures like climate change. But specifically, you mentioned that the things about the future that really stick out for you are wars, climate change, and mass infertility. Now, can you sort of go into that a little bit? Like, why did you choose those three?
I think maybe random Google ads are starting to control my life a little more than I expect, because when you say that, I feel like that's kind of mental, but also I know they are major concerns that people do talk about, maybe partly just Elon Musk talking about mass infertility, but supposedly lots of studies are showing infertility is on the rise, be it from whatever, cell phones in the pocket or chemicals and plastics that you're eating in your fish sandwich. I don't know. But yeah, I think there's some really big issues on the way. I mean, look at Russia. Russia's kind of scaring me right now. I was at a birthday party in the weekend, and suddenly a headline popped up that was like, yeah, Russia's looking into ways to shut down offshore wind turbines and communication cables to the UK, and the only reason they'd be doing that is obviously to cut off communication for the UK, which means kind of war. So you can kind of ignore it or think, this is weird and slightly alarming. It doesn't really change how I live my life day to day. I don't have a huge stack of tins of beans and sausage in my house, but maybe that's a good idea. I don't know.
If you were drafted, would you go?
Oh man, that's a weird question. Yeah, I don't know. That's something that has happened historically, and I guess could happen again. I haven't thought so much about how realistic that would be, but I guess I would. I did some army stuff when I was younger, so I guess it would be unavoidable. But that would be quite a big change. I guess that would be my future sorted then, not that it's one that I'd want.
See how interesting that is, how you said you were scared of making decisions, but you just made one there quite easily, but only if it sets a path in motion for the future.
Sometimes being told that you're doing something and not having a choice is good. Like, I know there's kind of choice paralysis, isn't there? Like in the world now, there's so many different choices you can make. If you just want to buy some jeans, there's like skinny fit or regular fit or flares, or there's like 20, 30 different types of jeans and different sizes and textures and colours. So if you leave that shop, you've probably not made the right choice. Whereas, I don't know, back in the day, maybe there was 2 or 3 different jeans and they all fit pretty bad, but you'd leave feeling good about it.
Okay, so then we're going to go into the final thing that I asked everyone in that form, which is, ultimately what is the one thing that really does scare you? And you went with getting old, realising that I hate my job and feeling like I've wasted my life, not following my dreams, or generally not having enough free time, but also being locked into a shitty 9 to 5. Very tangible, very real, down to earth. Lots to unpack there, but we've only got so much time. So I'm going to ask you sort of 2 questions about that, which is firstly, what is it about the shitty 9 to 5 that scares you? And secondly, what is it about getting to an age where you haven't achieved your goals scares you?
Oh, Those are some big questions that I'm not sure I can answer. Yeah, I guess a 9 to 5. I've done plenty of jobs that just feel soulless and feel like you're watching years go by and just thinking, is this what I really want to be doing? And I realise now that some people genuinely did enjoy doing it. It's not that they were bad jobs, just it wasn't right for me, and they weren't playing into my strengths. But then, truly being able to reflect on what your strengths are can be challenging as well. To hold up that mirror and really understand like what am I actually good at. But yeah, I guess doing a 9 to 5, just wasting your time and not feeling totally fulfilled is kind of scary and more tangible than the bigger other world problems like climate change and war and water security and all those other threats. Maybe it's a third world problem. Maybe a war would make me not care so much about 9 to 5s. But then I'd be loving it. But I don't know. Maybe I've been spoiled.
So, based on what you've told us, I feel like that mainly your fear comes from just a fear of conflict, I think, in the future, but also a fear of confinement, because lots of things you're saying about sort of the 9 to 5 and also the how war is, a really terrifying, very real thing. It seems like conflict as a theme, as a concept, is something you find quite unsettling, quite scary, and also sort of being locked into a 9 to 5 situation, being locked into something is, it's confining in a metaphorical way. Mm-hmm. And there are two films in particular that I think, for a variety of reasons, would be a really good bit of exposure for you. The first being Children of Men, directed by Alfonso Cuarón in 2006. Now, this film deals with, very literally, the theme of mass infertility that you spoke about earlier, and is associated with wars as a result in a grounded and very realistic way. So, the film follows, it's 2027, we're not that far away from that in retrospect, and it follows Theo, who needs to escort a woman who's only pregnant on the planet, to a place where she can, safely give birth and hopefully start humanity up again. But I recommended you this because it's a very grounded and realistic approach to that theme of infertility, and it would form a good foundation for building emotional resilience towards any fears and concerns you have around that. And Theo, the main character whom we follow throughout the film, he has to make a number of very important decisions, which will basically affect the fate of mankind. So you may find some common ground with the character, but more so, it should help you sort of navigate and confront your own fears of making decisions, because whatever one you do need to make, I doubt it'll be one where the fate of humanity hangs on it. And sometimes it's good to get perspective like that.
More what to have for dinner, so...
Yeah, exactly. Now, the second film is called Brazil, directed by Terry Gilliam in 1985. Now, this one is like a dystopian black comedy, and it's specifically about the confinements, implications, and horrors of bureaucracy, mass consumerism, and mind-numbing dead-end jobs. It follows Sam, who wishes to break free from this totalitarian regime and experience something outside of the mundane, the boring, the conformist. Basically, everything you described in your nightmare job scenario. And I've recommended you this because of its direct tie-in with your fears of being stuck in that 9 to 5, but to an extreme. And like with Children of Men, simulating that experience in a safe setting, a film, you could strengthen sort of emotional resilience and sort of psychological preparedness to being stuck in such a situation, if dystopia, as we are currently experiencing it, takes us in that direction. But also, this isn't just a film about a man stuck in this nightmare scenario. It actually follows his confrontation with that regime, and he meets a community of people with the same goal, and ultimately follows his endeavours to escape. And so you might find comfort in those plights. a solidarity with him. And I think these two films, they tap in very nicely into what you're scared of, what you're concerned about. And I think in watching those, you might be at ease for a moment. Do you have any questions for me?
No, but they sound awesome. I haven't heard of either of those films. Brazil sounds really interesting, so I'll definitely check them out. Thank you very much.
Commencing interview with patient 07201994. Can you please state your name?
Good. My name is Inoculation.
So basically, Nashaya, what we're going to do is go through your screening form that you sent to us. So before we start, could you just briefly tell me what brought you to us today? Do you feel that you lack emotional resilience in sort of facets of your life? Are there things that you want to be braver about?
Not really, it's just every day you'll have different emotion towards your life, like your routine. So I think will be nice if you just can like plan the day and plan what your emotion will be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that does. It's you want to be ready for the day ahead, regardless of what it throws at you.
Yeah.
What we're going to do is look at your sort of pandemic sort of living and what that was like for you, and briefly go into that. Then we'll look at some phobias. Pandemic life. Basically, we asked every candidate sort of why do you feel more stressed and anxious because of lockdown, if at all. Can you sort of briefly explain why you feel more stressed and anxious?
Well, the lockdown bit, it was experiment. Like, oh, you have to stay home and what you're gonna do. Something like that. I didn't feel more like anxious during the lockdown, but when I felt anxious because I had a lot of things to be done. For example, like I was in the middle of my thesis for my master degree. I can't go to uni, I can't do anything, so I have to be at home and just study from home. So that was my anxious things. And but after pandemic, it's impact me a lot. For example, I had a lot of question. Keep asking myself, what if the pandemic didn't happen? What my life would be?
And is that a regular thought you have?
Yeah,
thinking
it is.
about what would happen?
Yeah, it is. It's always like, if the pandemic not happen, will I be here, or I will do totally something different? Kind of like I think I lost the opportunities to do the thing that I would like to do. That is about post-pandemic. Yeah.
Do you feel that there is an uncertainty in life now that we're past COVID,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
that scares you?
Some days scared, some days not. Some days feel like it's a challenge, but some days it was like, oh shit, how can I do it? Something like that, yeah. But it's depend on the day, and it's depend like the emotional of each day. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, so what we're going to do now is briefly look at some of your sort of general phobias and fears that you mentioned to us. The two biggest ones being trypophobia
Yes.
and oceans.
Yeah.
Trypophobia is an interesting one, it's that fear of tiny holes.
Yes.
And oceans, that's quite, thalassophobia, that's quite a big one. Can you just explain your fear of trypophobia, please?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I probably like over 15 years now. So when I was younger, I have to move to the house, like leave the house immediately because we got a flood. It's like really big things from where I came from. And we have to stay at kind of like a room, like very, very little room for 3 people, me, my parents. Yeah, and the toilet, they got like small hole in the wall, and I was like, I don't like it. I don't really like it. That is what it started off. And once I grew up, I went to university. My friend showed me the pictures of a lot of holes on like people's face or skin. It's like something isn't right. Something put in the wrong place. Like, you know, the lotus, kind of like the hole in the lotus is in the right place, that where it should be. But once that thing is transferred to like to the wall, to human arms, or so it's not right. So that's why I was like, no, not really fan.
Interesting thing. Things being in the wrong place
Yeah.
makes you quite afraid, and yeah, it is a weird one. I thought another thing with trypophobia
Yeah,
is the idea of these small holes
yeah,
being ambiguous. Like you look into a hole and you're like, well, I can't see what's in there, so there could be something. And does that freak you out a bit?
yeah. I think so, because you don't know what in it. It might be nothing, or it might be something, but it's just the holes, like something in the wrong place. Yeah.
What I noticed, Nishaya, is that a lot of your phobias, or the sort of things that you're worried about or scared of genuinely, they do bleed into some of your future concerns, and I'll go more into that later on. But you spoke a little bit about being afraid of not handling the future, not being able to really handle it. And I was just interested what you meant by that.
So, like, humanities from got nowhere, they survive because they got the adaptability. It's just afraid that in the future, if things change, the world changed, but if I'm not changed and I can't handle it, like what should I do? For example, like now we do contactless, right? And in the future, if I like imagine like an old lady, she doesn't know how to do the contactless. Now she's gonna be afraid of like living her life like don't know how to use the machine, the technology is like far further ahead, and what am I doing? It's like can't like not really be independent.
Does that bleed into a little bit where you spoke about fear of having a loss of purpose or feeling useful?
Lost, yes, yeah, it does. Like in the futures, if you got everything that you ever wanted and you lost the purpose to live. For example, you lost the drive to do something that you like. Yeah, so that is quite scary. Like, and you don't know what you're gonna do, like how you're gonna handle it.
What I'm picking up there is that you've got this worry or fear that you are not going to be able to keep up with the speed that the world is evolving
Yes.
or changing.
Yes.
And I guess the last thing I want to go into about the future there, as you mentioned, a global pandemic, global warming, deforestation, as your three, big concerns about the future, sort of on a global scale. Can you just briefly explain what is it about those three things that really, freak you out or concerns you the most?
Well, the global pandemic is more about you don't know where it come from. You might know, but sometimes it's just too late. Too many people lost and die. In my country where I came from, we got a pandemic, but not COVID. It's something about the bird flu. A lot of people die because of it. And now we just take the vaccination. We don't know what we put into our body, and we don't know what I will be in the next 40 years if I'm still alive. So it's more about the science stuff. I'm scared because I am live in two cultures, and I can see the difference between Western world and Eastern world. Western world, they're more worried about futures, about the global warming and stuff. But Eastern, especially Southeast Asia, we're just worried about how to survive each day. They're not worried about long-term generation. They're just thinking about, what we're gonna eat today because we don't have money. How can I gonna support the family? I don't have money, so that they not give a fuck about the I mean, if I'm completely honest. Yeah, but the people lower class, they still use lots of plastic. They just don't think about alternative and stuff. So that quite scare me, because like too unbalancing. Some is try to save, but some it just don't know, and they probably wanted to save the world, but they just can't because they can't afford it. Everything come in paper packaging. It's just expensive.
I'm interested in what you said about being part of the Western and Eastern cultures and that difference. You know, which culture has influenced the way you think and feel and live the most?
That really good question. I think it's more Western, because it's weird. Because because when I know more about the thing, that made me think ahead. But once I go back to my country, I was like, why are they not thinking about it? And but the damage is already done. I think it's more to like a Western side, and also Eastern side in terms of worried about you're not gonna keep it up to the page, like to the pace when like in the futures about the technologies and stuff, because we're far behind. Yeah, you're right. It's both. Yeah.
Okay, so after having that conversation with you and going through our notes, basically I've come to the conclusion that your fear is one that comes from fear of the unknown. That's what I'm getting at. And that's sort of mirrored in your fears of the ocean. The ocean is a dark, mysterious place. We don't know really what's going on there. Trypophobia is an interesting sort of window there, because it shows a fear of the unknown again, because seeing something in a place where it doesn't belong, you know, begs the question, how did that get there? We don't know. And also the uncertainty of life post-pandemic. It in itself is uncertain, it's an unknown. So all of the things you've mentioned, you know, whether you sort of are consciously aware of it or not, I think all stem back from a fear of the unknown. What I'm going to do is prescribe you 3 films that I think, in their own ways, deal with your fear of the unknown. So the first film I want to recommend is called Underwater, directed by William Eubank in 2020. Now, fear of the unknown, it's quite ubiquitous in a genre called cosmic horror, which is coined by H.P. Lovecraft. Cosmic horror is basically a form of fiction, like a scary fiction, where the threat is of an unknown origin, meaning, you know, from a place unexplored. And Underwater basically follows a crew, an excavation crew at the bottom of the ocean, who start getting attacked by this unknown force. Now, conveniently, this film actually taps into all of the fears that we've spoken about today in quite a succinct way. The uncertainty and the unknown of the darkness of the ocean, and also these potholes that open up in the sea, these cracks in the walls that seep through. And I think that's quite reminiscent of what you were talking about. And I've also recommended it because it depicts a scenario where the threat is completely unknown and unseen. It's hidden. However, the threat itself does get revealed, and the crew work together to overcome it. So it gives face and it gives closure to this invisible threat. And a lot of the time, the fear of the unknown, that's where it stems from, this unfaced, unseen threat. So in experiencing that situation, you should build some resilience, particularly towards those fears of the unknown and potentially the ocean. So that's film number 1. Number 2 is fairly similar. It's called Annihilation and was directed by Alex Garland, I believe in 2019 or 2018, I can't quite remember.
I think I watched that one.
You've watched that one?
That one, yeah.
Well, that film, well, it's good that you've already seen it, so you may
Yeah.
be familiar, but it's similar in that it's about a cosmic horror. It's something that's unknown.
Yeah.
Things that happen in it, it's that idea of things just not being where they're supposed to.
Exactly, like that crocodile.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The man's organs moving around in his
Yeah.
body. I just threw that in there just because I thought maybe that'd be something to revisit for you. But if you've
Yeah.
already seen it, fantastic. I'll move on to the third one then, which is called Contagion, a film by Steven Soderbergh from 2011. Now this one I've thrown in purely for your pandemic-related concerns, because it depicts the outbreak of a deadly virus from China, of all places, in a very realistic way, and it's extremely reminiscent of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it allows for you to safely experience the pandemic again and all those unknown, unseen threats that go with it in a simulated space. And another important thing about it is that it applies the whole thing to a community. We were very much alone during the pandemic, but by watching it happen to other people fictitiously in a community, you feel part of one yourself. But yeah, so do you have any questions for me at all?
Not really at the moment. Try to take it in.
That's great. Thank you very much, Nashai.
Thank you.
Okay, commencing interview with client 05041995. Can you please state your name?
Mishka.
So here at Lumiere ERI Specialists, we offer we prescribe media to help you build emotional resilience or psychological preparedness to various things in the future or various concerns and fears you currently have. Can you just tell us briefly, why did you decide to come and use our services today?
Well, I'm feeling pretty down about the state of the world and fancied something to change my mind on that.
So what we're going to do, Mishka, is go through your screening form that you answered before coming to our appointment today. And in it, I've asked quite a lot of questions about fears, general phobias, as well as fears and concerns for the future, and things like that. Okay, so in terms of post-pandemic life, you've said that you felt no real change in your stress or your fears or anxiety since then. Why do you think that is?
I think it's largely gone back to how it sort of was before, pre-pandemic. I think a lot of the world factors that are stressful at the minute are sort of there before the pandemic, and they're almost a bit more concerning than the actual pandemic itself. And yeah.
And those things you said, that are associated with the pandemic, can you list some of those off? I think you said war.
So obviously with the pandemic, everyone was pretty socially isolated. To a degree, that's gone back to sort of how it was. Obviously, there's a large proportion of the population who's still quite isolated. But now the main concerning thing is obviously the war in Ukraine.
Now we're going to briefly touch on your general sort of phobia or fears, only briefly because I don't think it sticks out as something which is going to be a genuine problem for you anytime in the future. But you mentioned snakes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, do you just want to talk to me about that?
No, they're just creepy. The way they have no legs, but they can just move about. And yeah, visually it's pretty concerning. Just the way they wiggle and somehow project themselves forward. And they're just, I don't know.
Do you have a problem with looking at images of snakes or films of them?
Yeah, it's the look of snakes more than anything, rather than like, oh, a snake's gonna bite me. They're just, I don't know. Yeah, I don't like them.
You said one of the parts of the uncertainty of the future, which is really quite daunting, is a lack of general security in things such as jobs and houses. Why have you mentioned that in particular?
Just because anyone can be fired from their job at the minute, and pretty much anyone can be kicked out from the house, especially people who are renting. Yeah, big thing in Cornwall at the minute.
And what is it specifically about that frightens you?
Well, you can't really know where you're going to be in, say, a month, 2 months, 3 months, a year. Like, nothing's really set in stone or certain. So I guess it's difficult to plan things in a way.
Do you think that uncertainty, well, specifically when you mentioned the difficulty to plan for the future, is that something you've been scared of before the pandemic, or you think it's been brought about because of it?
I think it's been exacerbated by the pandemic, yeah.
And what do you find discomforting about that in your personal situation?
So me, I struggle quite a bit with anxiety. The fear of the unknown it sort of feeds into that. Produces quite a lot of stress on a personal level. I like to know when things are, what they're going to be, sort of where I'm going to be day to day.
Now, in the form I included a spectrum of sort of things that could happen in the future. Some of them are quite speculative and a bit silly, like alien abductions and mandatory veganism, things like that. But then more grounded ones, things that are happening and have happened before. You chose nuclear war, climate change, and military draft. Now, can you just briefly go into why you chose those three things?
So I personally think those are the three biggest threats to humanity at the minute. Climate change, obviously, a major one. It's been going on for years and years and years, and not a whole lot's been done to it. Obviously, with the population as big as it is, and society the way it is, the way we mass consume, it's pretty scary where we're going on and how little has actually been done about climate change in the grand scheme of things. Sort of had a token effort, in my opinion. But and then sort of nuclear war, obviously, since Oppenheimer invented the nuclear bomb, that's been an ongoing thing. Obviously, it peaked pretty much in the 60s, but I think now it's sort of coming back around, I guess, with the tensions between the East and the West, specifically Russia and Ukraine, and the Western countries such as the USA, especially with the leadership the way it is between Biden and Putin. I think it's quite scary having those people in charge, so to speak. And then military draft, again, going back to Ukraine and Russia war, there is a high likelihood of being drafted into a war coming off of that, or directly into that war, I think.
Reflecting on that, I said that, above all, what are you most afraid of happening? And you ended on nuclear war. And I guess that's interesting because in a nuclear war, climate change and military drafting is kind of covered in that, wouldn't it, really? So could you just list off a couple of things about nuclear war that freaks you out?
So, like, the fact no one's safe. Obviously there's the direct blast zone and people being vaporized and whatnot, which is in and of itself a pretty scary thought, just being just nothing like that. Just like nuclear fallout, and you could be miles and miles away and have the effects of nuclear war, and it only takes, a few bombs and that's it. That's pretty much humanity just sort of wiped out. There's no coming back from that. I think that's sort of the scariest thing. But just the sheer power of a nuclear bomb, man. Like the way it just vaporizes stuff. And seeing pictures of like Nagasaki and Hiroshima where people have been like burnt onto the street, and like their sort of shadows just etched into the stone. So pretty frightening, man.
Your case is very specific in that there are lots of sort of things that you find unsettling. There are two films that I'm prescribing you today based on the concerns that you've expressed, and the first one is called Threads, directed in 1984 by Bill Hines. And this film depicts, in a notoriously realistic way, what would happen if a nuclear bomb was dropped off the coast of the UK. And it's not just sort of a horror drama thing, it shows chronologically the events leading up to the bomb. It shows us some characters that we get to know their ambitions and their goals, which are basically, they disappear, they vaporize. And we also get to see how the government responds, what becomes of government, of policing, of military, and also of drafting, which becomes something quite dark in that film. And I recommend you watch this because it basically allows you, in a safe way, to experience a simulation of nuclear war, but applying it to a context that you're familiar with, that being the UK. So you can sit down and watch this film, experience it in all its horror, and hopefully build up some kind of resilience or an emotional preparedness if you were to be in that scenario. The second film I want to recommend is called Come and See, which is a Russian film directed in 1985 by Elem Klimov. And this is often cited as one of the greatest anti-war films ever made. Specifically because, well, not only is it anti-Nazi, it shows without any sort of drawback the implications of war, the horrors of war, and the quick sort of disintegration of this idea of camaraderie and of patriotism, and actually just shows you a very, very bleak, surreal, horrible reality. I recommend this one because, like with Threads, it presents itself in a very realistic way. It allows you to experience war in a realistic way, in a safe way, and then in turn offering you sort of an emotional resilience perhaps to these scenarios. But yeah, so that was Come and See by Elem Klimov and Threads by Bill Hines. But yes, do you have any questions for me before we end?
No, I think that's pretty well covered. Thanks
Excellent.
very much.